Sorry, I'll start again. Hello and welcome, had to happen, to the first of our public lectures at Anglia, Ruskin, the Policing Institute for the Eastern Region. This is the first of our 2021 lectures, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you here today. We've had 4 of these events, a series previously in previous years, typically face-to-face, where I haven't had to remember to unmute, and my apologies for that. What we try and do during these public lecture series is focus on really topical areas of interest to policing, and we bring together leading academics, researchers, policing practitioners and policymakers. In the past, we've hosted public lecture series on areas such as vulnerability, collaboration, and last year was extremism. This year we are focusing on crime and policing during a pandemic, which obviously is incredibly topical, and policing and the world over is facing unprecedented challenges. And what we want to do during this public lecture series is bring together leading academics working in the field with police practitioners who are experiencing the challenges of policing during this unprecedented time, and to reflect and share their experiences with us. Before I introduce you to our speaker, some detail about how the event will run. We have about 45 minutes to an hour of a presentation, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. Now, we will open the Q&A right from the beginning, so if you have a question, please do share it, and we will try and get as many through to our speaker as we can at the end. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome and introduce our speaker today, Professor Graham Farrell from the University of Leeds. Graham is a criminologist and professor of crime science, and a world-leading expert on situational crime prevention, crime trends, designing out crime, to name but a few things. And just on a personal note, one of my academic heroes. Over the last recent months, Graham has been extremely busy working with colleagues from UCL, amongst others, conducting a UKRI funded project into the reduction of crime harms during the pandemic. And I am absolutely delighted that he is here today to share some of the insights from that work with us. Thank you very much, Graham.
Thank you, Sam, for that wonderful introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much to Sam and Anglia Ruskin for the introduction. And thank you for coming along to this online lecture. Shortly after lockdown was announced on 23rd of March, the UK Research and Innovation, which oversees the research councils, quickly announced an open call for research into issues relating to coronavirus and the pandemic. This was an open call on any area of issues, so it included people testing the efficacy of face masks and all sorts of medical issues, but also covered social issues relating to the pandemic. And I applied along with a team of colleagues from Leeds and University College London to undertake research to reduce the crime harms of the coronavirus pandemic. So what I'm going to do today, so we've been up and running effectively now for 5 months, which is not long in research terms at all, but I think research time seems to have moved differently for me during the pandemic, and it does seem like a long time. And when I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today, it was going to be the sort of greatest hits of the last 5 months, because we've done a range of different things, and that's what I'm going to take you through. So I'm going to introduce the project and the project team, because a lot of the work that I'm going to take you through today has been undertaken by other people. This is far from just me, so I'm showcasing different aspects of the work of the team. When I've introduced it, I'm going to then do 5 parts. The aim here is to try and keep you interested, rather than just do one long and technical overview of an individual study. I'm going to show you different components of the research. So I hope that'll keep you interested, and I will try to give you guide steers as to where you can find out more information about it, about each study, and that'll be in the range of publications that we've already developed. So this is the research team, starting with this suspicious chap here, Dr. Daniel Burks. Sorry, these are all my, I'm very fortunate to be working with people who I've known as friends as well as colleagues for many years. So clockwise from Burks, who is B, there are 6 of us who are investigators: Dan Burks, Kate Bowers, as myself, Shane Johnson, who Kate and Shane are both professors at University College London. Nick Mallison, who is Professor of Geography at Leeds. Nick Tilley there in his the attire, I believe, for his daughter Jo's wedding, who is also Professor at University College London. Then our 3 researchers employed on the project, who are Anthony Dixon, who's a data scientist at the bottom here, Sam Langton, who's recently joined us as research fellow in crime science, and Manya Nikolovska, who is a fellow based at working with Shane and Kate at UCL. So a lot of the, again, I mean, if I'm allowed to offer them compliments, from my perspective, I was very fortunate to be the principal investigator for this project. And what you want as a principal investigator in a project is to have experienced, talented colleagues who just turn up with a lot of work. So it's, you know, remarkable from my perspective, and I feel very fortunate to be working with this team. We also have a set of national partners built into the project, many of whom signed up at the time of application and others who've joined subsequently, including we have a national advisory committee to guide the research from the Home Office, the National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing, as well as a colleague from City of London Policing. We have Metropolitan Police, Lancashire and Durham as close partners, and you'll see some of the research we've done with Lancashire already. I will showcase. We have international partners in Australia, Netherlands, Sweden and the US, with whom we're developing comparative research. We now have, since we started, formal partnerships with British Transport Police. I'll show you a little bit of that data. And with DEFRA in relation to work that Nick Tilley has developed on the issue of waste crime. Waste crime having become quite an issue, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, when a lot of local council tips closed. Anyway, I may come back to that. We've also had contact with Optalo, which is the police national coordinating effort for the policing of the pandemic, and interact with them and with the aim of hoping to make our research useful to Optala and other areas of policing and crime reduction. Let me just mention at the bottom left, you see there Emily Sheard, who worked with us for 3 months during the setup and development of the project, to whom I'm grateful for stepping in at very short notice. So one of the ways in which we have moved the project forward is that we set up 3 publication series that are edited by different members of the team. Kate Bowers is editor of Crime Science, set up a special collection on crime and COVID-19. That's a peer-reviewed journal. Then Nick Tilley and Gloria Laycock, who's not formally a member of the project, but is a professor at UCL, set up the Jill Dando Institute special papers on COVID-19. I'm going to talk about some of those, and I will showcase some of them to give you a flavour of what they're about and hopefully lead you to look at some of the others. And I set up with an edit with Anthony Dixon, our data scientist, a new series called a Statistical Bulletin on Crime and COVID-19. Again, I'm going to use some of the data from these publications. One of the advantages I would say is that it's, for me, these outlets have been extremely useful to allow us to deliver timely products. This research is very different to most research that I've been involved in before, insofar as we are living it real time, and we have to try and feed the research back to policymakers and practitioners in policing, as quickly as possible, and by setting up our own publication series, we're able to do that. We're also fortunate that about a dozen or so of the JDI special papers and the statistical bulletins have already been reproduced in Policing Insight, which is the leading practitioner outlet for policing. In addition to these publication series being vehicles for our own publications, they've also attracted publications from other people working in this area. So I'm quite pleased that they are also attracting that broader attention, as an academic journal always does, but the JDI special papers in particular have a whole host of authors from different institutions who have developed work relating to typically crime-specific issues relating to COVID-19, but we've also got specific policy issues, etc. So we host these now on a single project website, which is www.KOBI19-crime.com, where when you click onto it, that's the front page. It's fairly basic. It takes you straight to the lists of publications, and there are the 3 lists of publications. So that's the front page. I didn't want to switch to it here, but I've got, this will show you, if you scroll down the page, you see the 3 publication sets. Those with an asterisk are ones that have been authored by members of the project team, which is most of the statistical bulletins, about half of the JDI special papers, 2 of the crime science special collection, but below there, when you continue to scroll down, there are also other products, including another journal article that Nick Tilley already co-authored, and other various products. So this is just to, again, I'm giving you some background information on the work and the information that I hope will allow you to dig into this further if you want to. If you look at that list of the special papers, there's a whole host of areas, and there's 10 more below that in the special papers. So I'm going to do a few minutes showcasing one of the special papers and one of the journal articles, and then I'm going to go through a series of topic specific issues, the early stages of the pandemic, and broaden up to a review of 6 months of crime trends in the pandemic. Oh, sorry. So first actually going to be the first early lockdown, then it's going to be local lockdown analysis, then it's going to be 6 months of trends in the pandemic. So this is from the special paper number 24. I like this because I hope it'll grab your attention. This is work I am engaged with Professor Shane Johnson, who is director of the Crime Futures Centre, the Doors Centre for Crime Futures at UCL, and it's looking ahead. And this is something you can't do typically in an academic journal, is say, hey, we think this is going to be a problem imminently. So think about the vaccine. The vaccine is one of the obviously the big issues of the pandemic. I checked the New York Times vaccine checker online as of this morning. It's 6 vaccines have currently been approved for limited use, but none for full use. They're still all under research. We don't know how long it's going to take until they come out. When they are approved, they will then have to go into mass production, which presumably could take months or years. And then if you think about it, there are 7.8 billion potential customers in the world. That's the global population, and everybody needs vaccine. This is going to generate a huge demand. This is going to generate potentially high prices for vaccines on an illicit market. We think it's going to stimulate a huge amount of thefts of shipments of products. You've already heard of espionage, industrial espionage relating to theft of the vaccine formula, for example, including with states involved. There's been allegations that Russia has been involved, for example. We think there'll be a lot of shipment theft and robbery, from stick-ups to hijacks to thefts from distribution points. You know, if vaccines are typically distributed from somewhere like a public gymnasium so that you can get a lot of people in a queue, then overnight, where are they stored? Unless they're stored securely, they're going to be stolen. There's going to be huge amounts of counterfeit vaccines. This is a door opener for frauds when you have a conversation starter about vaccines to approach people. There's going to be potentially huge illegal resale markets, which could be online. And I think this is going to generate systemic violence related to the product and around all of these issues, and particularly corruption. Now, not just in the UK, but particularly internationally, where other countries, according to Transparency International, have higher rates of endemic corruption. So we think this is going to be a huge issue, and that if we don't move quickly to do something about it, it's going to be extremely problematic over the potentially the next few years. Tomorrow, Shane and I are meeting with a colleague from the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency to talk about this issue and their preparation. We're in the overlap area here between research and practice, I think, which makes it fascinating. But our aim is to try and do useful research, and this short paper we wrote is just a 2-page paper, is based on our theories of the understanding of crime, which I've skipped through here for present purposes. But we think there's a huge potential to develop situational crime prevention measures to intervene, depending on where measures are. I suspect that that all the avenues for theft have not been closed, so we need rapid reviews. All crime is concentrated, and this is going to be the same. It's going to concentrate into hotspots. It's going to be repeated victimization of the same targets for theft, etc., using the same methods. One of the things that's been prominent in the pandemic is the use of light touch administration, and this is potentially going to be a tricky issue if it means that there are more loopholes for potential theft and diversion of products. So there are a range of potential policy avenues to be explored, but I think there's something we're looking at. I would say we're staring it in the face. There's going to be a vaccine crime wave. I would put money on it. You can see that. You can almost see the headlines. So I mentioned that to try and give you a flavour of the types of topics covered in the JDI special papers, of which there are 24. That's the most recent one. This is another separate piece of work in which Shane has also been involved with Manja Nikolovska and Paul Ekblom, which analyses police tweets, and they have culled a large amount of tweets and analysed them essentially. I'm going to move quickly through it to see if we can use tweeting more strategically as the aim. Let's try and the overall aim of the project is try to develop practical implications for policing in other areas. Their analysis showed, it's quite remarkable if you look at the paper, and I recommend people have a look at it, that tweets about particular issues preceded the changes in those crime types. The tweeting preceded lockdown, as some of the changes in crime types did. Here on these charts, fraud, cybercrime, domestic abuse and general crime, you see the vertical column. So for here in fraud, for example, this is the vertical column where lockdown occurred. So that runs from September 2019, monthly data through to May. And tweeting about fraud began much earlier in the year, well preceding lockdown. Similarly, tweeting about cybercrime and the risks this is from police agencies, preceded lockdown, and it did in each case. And what they also found is that, so they found that Twitter, via the tweets via police forces, actually anticipated the crime trends, which is quite remarkable. Do we potentially have a source of predicting crime trends through tweets? I don't know. But they also identified factors that increase retweets. Now, retweets indicate something that people are more interested in, or perhaps that's more useful. And so their argument is that we may be able to use this kind of information to try to develop an evidence-based social media engagement strategy for policing. One of the components of the project, I just wanted to introduce it here. Again, I say, go and look at their work if you wish to pursue it further. I think it's got significant potential. This is also from one of the Jill Dando Institute special papers, which is a categorization of different types of crime effects in the pandemic. And I'm going to talk today primarily about those that group into changes in crime due to changes in physical mobility, due to the restrictions, local lockdowns in the pandemic. There is also a range of crimes that have been affected by virtual mobility, online crimes, cyber crimes potentially. There are a set of crimes that for which there are new means of commission. If we think about fraud in particular, furlough fraud has been huge. Business loans fraud now estimated in many millions of pounds, where businesses have been given £50,000 for relatively small amounts of procedure and checks compared to normal, which has facilitated a lot of fraud. And that's a huge area that where there's potential for a huge amount of research. Actually, although it looks like we have a large team, there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm conscious of the fact there are a lot of areas that we haven't really dug into yet. And the furlough fraud, the business loans fraud are huge areas, particularly if the pandemic is going to continue and we're going to be in this situation potentially for several years. Product prices have changed in ways that affect certain types of crime, and there are of course civil law breaches. But I'm going to move on quickly because I don't want to use all my time up to talk about some analysis we did of the national lockdown initially, and then I'm going to go into the local lockdown. And this is work that was published in the peer-reviewed journal Crime Science. Work conducted with Eric Halford, who is a Detective Chief Inspector at Lancashire, which is one of our partner agencies. And Eric very quickly moved to provide good daily level crime data. Now, the advantage of this is that the publicly available data, which I'm going to talk you through some of that later, is aggregated at the monthly level. And for looking at what happened in national lockdown, the daily count data was particularly useful because it allowed us to track how particular types of crime had changed from day to day and how these changes corresponded with different policy changes at the time. And we also, as part of this work, linked these changes more formally to mobility. It sounds obvious, and it is conceptually obvious to think, oh, huge changes in mobility in society with national lockdown from the 23rd of March, and that's what affected crime, and I think it did, but until you show it and show the relationship, it is largely a hypothesis. And there were a lot of competing explanations at the time as well, from people, and very different expectations about what was going to happen in relation to crime. So what you see here is that these are trends in mobility from Google COVID-19 mobility reports showing that in different areas of life, in particular public transport, retail and recreation areas, the number of people in those areas declined dramatically with lockdown. You all know this, most people have seen it on the news, that was highlighted. And we also saw a dramatic drop in all recorded crime in the early days of the pandemic on this side. The four vertical lines there are the timing of events, the WHO announcement of the 11th of March to say this is a global pandemic. The UK announcement from the 16th of March by Boris Johnson that there should be no non-essential travel. On the 20th of March, bars and restaurants closed. and then national lockdown from the 23rd of March. It seems a long time ago now. But there were the way in which these different announcements affected crime fits with how they affected mobility and makes sense in terms of the types of the crime that they affected. So we used, in fact, on the last chart, there was a grey area. I'll just flip back to it here, showing confidence intervals. Again, I hope you're somewhat familiar with these now from a lot of data being in the public, discussed in the public domain, which has been great, I think, for quantitative analysis. And the grey area there was the expected, and the dotted line was the expected crime trend. And this was the actual crime trend. And this was the grey area is the confidence intervals. So it was statistically significantly outside, dramatically outside those confidence intervals by the end of March. But the sequence and the trajectory of how individual crime types changed also reflected both the policy timeline and changes in mobility. So the most obvious example, the clearest example, I think, was the change in public order crimes that coincided with the closures of bars and restaurants rather than with other aspects of policy. And when you look into this in detail, you can, and I'm going to move too quickly through it to highlight ones other than that, you can see that the sequences of changes in individual crime types was linked to those two aspects, policy and mobility. Obviously, they are interrelated as well. And one of the things we developed as part of this work was to try and formally link mobility to crime. And we developed a tool and an analytic approach called the mobility elasticity of crime. These charts show the black lines are the crime types and the shaded areas are the mobility. So here, for example, you see just shoplifting, and if we've paired them in areas that make sense as pairs. So shoplifting, you would expect to be influenced by movement in retail and recreation areas, particularly retail areas, obviously, but not by movement in residential areas, of course. And they track each other well. And the elasticity measure is a gauge of how well they track each other. In residential areas, in fact, movement of people increased because people were staying at home. This, we theorised, provided more guardianship, and so there was a reduction in burglary, which coincides inversely, tracks inversely but well the increase in mobility in residential areas. So the relationship between mobility and crime varies from particular type and crime type and context, is the argument, I think, and we think there's a significant potential to pursue this research further to tie it down further. And so I recommend looking at that research further. I'm just shop windowing it here, and I'm going to move on to introduce some of the work we did on the first local lockdown in Leicester, which you'll remember was way back in, must have been months ago now. This is work that we published as issue 7 of the Statistical Bulletin on Crime and COVID-19, which is on the website I pointed you to. And we believe it was the first published analysis of the effects of the local lockdown. We were using publicly available data from Police UK and published it the day after the public data became available, because our data scientist Anthony had already set up the analytic runs to do the analysis, and we'd developed them conceptually, so we were able to produce it quickly. Our aim was to be the first to get something out there. We sent this work to Leicester Police, and I've been in touch with the police there with a view to developing the work further, and with Optala with a view to developing further types of analyses if we can. And local lockdowns, as you know, have now evolved into the tier system in the UK of medium, high and very high lockdown. So what was originally framed as local lockdowns have become the primary policy tool for restricting the interaction of people to try and reduce the spread of coronavirus. So our aim in looking at this is also looking at this area is also to try and tease out potential implications in relation to crime and policing. You know, are there lessons we could learn from Leicester, and if we can conduct other analyses that can inform policing from now onwards. At the time, Leicester went into lockdown because it had 10% of the national new positive virus tests, but only 1% of the population. And it was introduced in the last week of June. We had also developed conceptual models of how we expected crime to change over time under lockdown and as we go forward. And this is a quick glimpse at some of that work. So this is for just crimes that declined in lockdown. There is at the bottom, you'll see that there's a corresponding mirror image for crimes that increased during lockdown. So the potential for crimes that went down, as shown in the red part of each chart, is they could continue being low. That would be great. They could gradually resume. They could go up and down again if there was further lockdown. We conceived of a potential, so that was called a W shape. Then a local W would be a local lockdown if the early one was national. They could entirely bounce back as a V shape, which is what everyone hoped would happen to the economy, for instance. Or it could be more of a J shape. With crime could bounce back conceivably to higher rates than before the pandemic. And I developed this with Dan Burks, and we again published this in the JDI special series, Nick and Gloria, even though it wasn't crime specific. We're generous enough to allow us to put it out there. And I think it's still a useful reference point in terms of looking at how crime effects have begun to track through the system. And although I realise I'm presenting the data in a slightly different format here, this is a summary, perhaps, of our initial finding for Leicester, which was that in July, again, it's not rocket science, it does make sense in terms of mobility. In July, when the first month in which Leicester had a local lockdown, the rate of crime in Leicester did not return back towards its more usual levels to the same extent it did in other cities. We discussed at great length that the best research design for this, should we be comparing Leicester to the nearby cities of Nottingham and Coventry most directly, or to other cities, and this shows the top 10 cities in the UK. Aside from Manchester, GMP, Greater Manchester Police, don't provide data to Police UK. All of the other territorial forces do. So this is the 10 largest cities, which includes Leicester, except for Manchester. We also looked at, since the lockdown was in the city of Leicester, we thought we'd look at the city compared to the rest of Leicestershire, the rest of the county, to see if there had been perhaps a displacement effect of crime moving outside the city, or alternatively a diffusion of benefits. Does the fact, if crime is staying down in the city, does that effect spread elsewhere? The results are not entirely conclusive. I don't think, aside from there's no evidence of displacement. I guess that is conclusive. It's a significant finding. What looks to have happened is that in the blue line for the rest of the county, this is crime and the other one is antisocial behaviour. There's a slightly greater dip. These show the confidence intervals that I discussed earlier. That are the normal levels. So here was where crime in the city was statistically significantly lower than expected. Then it started to creep up as movement returned to normal, but even though that was at a lower rate in Leicester than elsewhere. This is analysis of crimes by type in Leicester. Again, I'm going to cover this quickly. There's a lot of information. I apologise for the information overload. If you look at shoplifting and theft from the person, they're the ones where Leicester is most is closest to. I think the change in theft in person in Leicester, where it continued down, theft from the person in Leicester, where it continued down during July, is one of the most significant explanations for the fact that Leicester didn't have the same increases that we saw elsewhere during its local lockdown. This is during the first stages of local lockdown. We're going to do further analysis on this to see what's happened subsequently, but this was a first run. But that same effect, Leicester's at the lower end for all of the types of crime, where crime had declined during lockdown in terms of its July increase. So again, it makes sense in terms of the theory that mobility is a key issue. These were the crimes that increased during lockdown, and it's not hugely conclusive, aside from there's a curiously large increase in weapons possession in Leicester, but then that also occurred in several other cities during the first month of the local lockdown. So not entirely conclusive, but again, I'm trying to showcase the different aspects of analysis we've been trying to undertake to tease out what's happening and the implications. Okay, this one, a lot of lines, but the top line here is Leicester. So this is our most recent analysis, and this runs from January to August. So this is the most recent data available. Each of these lines is a city, and they're indexed to 1 according to their crime rates during the previous 6 months. What we see in Leicester is that relative to its previous crime rate, in fact, it never really achieved, even in April, in national lockdown, relative to the other cities, it didn't achieve the same level of reductions as elsewhere. So this is ongoing work, and we're learning as we go. Perhaps its failure to, or the fact it didn't bounce back as much in local lockdown, reflects the fact that its crime rates hadn't gone down as much during initial lockdown. My hypothesis would be that I think would need further explanation is that the if Leicester had the higher rates of spread of the coronavirus, this may reflect higher rates of mobility in the city, which may also be those that generated the relatively higher crime rates in the city. Okay, I suspect this is generating as many questions as it's answering, and I think that's the nature of the research. I hope that's the fact, in fact, and I'm only giving you a flavour of it, I realise. The overall findings, I think, were consistent with those from the national lockdown. With the continued lockdown, you've got the continuation of this crime reduction effect, or the failure to bounce back as quickly in Leicester. It also become clear that antisocial behaviour was the main area in which there've been increases, and as we'll see in the next analysis, with the effects upon different crime types changing as lockdowns lifted. Sorry, I'll clarify that. I'll clarify that in the next few minutes as I go through this bit, which is our latest work, or one of the aspects of most recent work we've done, which is a review of 6-month trends, which goes up to using the publicly available data up to the end of August. So, and this was recently published in Policing Insight, as well as in one of the statistical bulletins. And my co-authors, Sam Langton and Anthony Dixon, are gonna, I hope they're not watching, because they're gonna kick me for using the different charts than the ones that were published. But I think these are quite clear. Here we show, this shows the change in antisocial behaviour relative to what was expected in the months March through August. So this chart shows the 2 of the 14 crime types in the publicly available data that increased during lockdown. Antisocial behaviour, not technically a crime, and drug offences. Antisocial behaviour increase is almost certainly reflecting lockdown breaches, and the increase in drug offences perhaps reflecting drug activity, police activity, or the fact that it may have been easier to spot drug dealers on streets that were not as populated as usual. Most of the other crime types showed the decline that I showed you earlier for Lancashire. This is now national level data. Violence and sex offences declined sharply in lockdown. This is to April compared to the expected rate for the Aprils from the 5 previous Aprils using a REMA analysis, autoregressive integrated moving average analysis. I've grouped the crime types in these 4 sets that I'm going to show you into similar types. So the last 2, antisocial behaviour and drugs, were the ones that increased. Violence and sex offences and public order offences, along with weapons offences, have quite similar patterns, surprisingly similar pattern between public order offences and weapons offences here. These are grouped because they are the public order and violence and sex offences are the ones that popped back into an above expected rate in July, which coincides with the pubs and bars reopening on July 4th. So it makes sense. Pubs and bars reopen. There are more fights and assaults in and around public areas, and alcohol related violence, I expect, from previously below expected levels. Remember that this 0 is the expected level for this time of year. So they've gone slightly above the expected levels. Whereas theft crimes have not yet returned to their expected levels. This begins at -10. They're not even close to their normal levels yet. And thefts showed the most dramatic declines during the pandemic early days. In April, theft from the person, nearly 80% lower than expected. And all of these different types of theft, shoplifting, robbery, other theft, nationally, show very similar trends of the steep initial decline and then the more gradual bounce back as movement has returned to the society, as the economy has rebooted. More people have started to go back to work. Those of us who are fortunate to be able to work at home are doing so, but more people have been encouraged increasingly to go back to work as we can. And so these crimes have also begun to creep back, but not, if you notice, to the same extent that violence and public order offences did, because it makes sense that they've not been influenced to the same extent by the opening of pubs and bars in July. And this last chart groups together crimes that are more related to residential areas, which are burglary, vehicle crime, bike theft, criminal damage. Not entirely residential areas, but burglary is in particular, which showed an initially steep drop and then a much more gradual return, because a lot of people still are at home and there is still greater guardianship in residential areas. So both vehicle crime and burglary, that is more likely to be in residential areas, burglary almost entirely, of course, completely, have not shown the same bounce back and still are around 1/3 below expected levels for August. Whereas if you remember, violence was above expected levels. So quite significant differences. It's not just a uniform decline or a uniform return. The bike theft is worth a quick mention. It's a slightly anomalous, with it had a similar decline, but then it's come back more quickly, I think, than the other crime types, which almost certainly reflects the greater demand for bikes and people cycling during the pandemic. Interesting little aside. Okay, 6:15. I'm going to move quickly. This is again to showcase what I think is a very interesting piece of analysis about the way in which crime changed. So this shows all types of time, all types of crime in different areas. So this area, I'll start at this far end is the 10% of areas, LSOAs, which is about 600 households, all grouped together for the country, which previously had the highest rates of crime. And they experienced declines in crime, whereas at the other end, the traditionally lower crime areas had the highest increases in crime rates, sometimes dramatic increases in crime rates. Whereas we got reductions in crime overall, with the movement in people away out of the cities, presumably to rural areas, which beforehand had lower crime rates, we've actually got increases in crimes in those areas. I think this type of analysis has got huge potential, and we found similar patterns for antisocial behaviour. I've got a lot of other analysis I had to cut from today because I realise I'm already throwing a huge amount of information at you, but it makes sense. Crime has moved out of the cities towards traditionally lower crime rural areas that have actually seen increases, even though in the aggregate these reductions dominate and produce a national decline in the crime rate. I didn't want to do this without giving you a quick show of some of our data from British Transport Police that Nick Tilley in particular is developing with Anthony Dixon in the analysis, and a colleague from British Transport Police. They've just published 2 statistical bulletins on this and are developing the work further. Quite a similar story. These charts show different types of crime and the number of passengers on trains. It's rail network crime, and British Transport Police has responsibility for passenger safety on the lines, on trains and at stations across the country. And there's surprisingly little analysis of BTP data out there. The interesting one on the right here is analysis of the time of day in which crime occurred. And even though there are dramatic declines in many types of crime, as you see on the left, the times of day in which they occurred were quite similar. We weren't sure that was going to be the case, but it is. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Little variation in the times of day, which almost is most likely to reflect the fact that there was an overall drop in passenger travel, which is the green line here, sorry, on each of these, a huge decline in passenger travel, and that it was probably fairly uniform across all times of the day. So the times at which crimes have been occurring during lockdown is quite similar. It didn't skew for particular types of times of the day. You can see for the most part the crimes fell with declines in passenger numbers, but again it makes sense mostly for those crime types that involve a victim of some sort. Theft, their dramatic decline. Violence, dramatic decline in line with the number of passengers. For those that are less, that are not directly related to number of passengers, such as graffiti, which tends to take place in and around stations, the decline has not been as great, similar with drug crimes. So these make sense. Again, I'm giving you a quick flavour, an introduction to types of analysis, and the locations in which they've occurred also have varied, there being biggest changes in on trains and at the stations, which is where the passengers normally were. Oops, why is it not moving on? There we go. So I'm very nearly done. What I've tried to give you is an introduction to different aspects of the work, the way in which we're approaching the issues from a whole host of different angles, and then I've shown you early lockdown, local lockdown, and the 6-month picture of crime in England and Wales so far. Again, I'm conscious of the fact there are many types of crime we haven't been able to address yet. I think we've done a lot, but there's still so much to do. We have a range of other things in the pot on which we're working. Waste crime that I alluded to before. Nick Tilley and Anthony Dixon have got information from about 150 local councils so far about waste crime, and waste crime is a huge under-researched issue more generally. Shane Johnson and colleagues at Mania Nikolovska has been leading a neighbourhood watch survey of household fraud that is going to be undertaken soon to try and gauge the level of fraud experienced by households. We're taking some cross-national comparative work, and we have someone work ongoing with Mani Gerol from Malmö University, who recently published on Swedish crime rates. And as I mentioned earlier, we have international collaborators in the US, Australia, and the Netherlands, with whom we are hoping to develop. We are developing cross-national comparative work. Is the experience in the UK similar to elsewhere? I think that the mediating variable is going to be mobility. And to give you a quick insight, that's what I think our comparative analysis with Sweden is beginning to show. Sweden, if you remember, is a fascinating case study because Sweden was quite controversial for not having the same strict lockdown that was introduced in many other countries. And Mani's analysis of Swedish crime rates shows that the effect upon crime was similarly not as dramatic. We're going to continue further lockdown analysis, further British Transport Police analysis. This is ongoing. Nick Mallison is currently working to obtain footfall data for different cities in the country from the local data company that you can then compare to crime rates to examine more closely the mobility and crime issue. So it's very much an evolving area. I'm nearly done, you can say. Thank you, you say. I mean, thank you, it's nearly finished. So for me, in relation to the big picture of the understanding of crime, the evidence from the pandemic reaffirms for me the notion that crime opportunities are central to everything, and crime opportunities have been influenced by changes to mobility, the movement of people. The fact that people are not interacting to the same extent in many public areas has reduced crimes in those areas. I've not today talked much about domestic violence, but the greater interaction of people in households in lockdown has provided greater opportunities for domestic violence. One of the reasons for that is that there are a range of other funded projects specifically on domestic violence that are working in that area. So although we touch on it in our research, we haven't gone into it to the same extent. It's a very different research environment for us, this almost live action research angle. It's quite different than normally you have several years to think about, conduct the research and then publish your research without the same pressure. We've been trying to be responsive. It's an exciting and challenging research field. And we're going to look further at the tiers models if we can. And some of the implications for policing, my apologies, implications for policing. So I think that as we go forward with lockdowns and tiers, the data from both early lockdown and more recently suggests there are pre-lockdown lasting spikes in violence and public order. And then as people move out of lockdown, this also generates, as you saw for the UK nationally, violence and public order resuming as pubs and bars reopen. I think there's a strong case that there's going to be a vaccine-related crime wave in the future. I would like to do more research into fraud, particularly furloughs and business loan fraud, which is a hugely under-researched area. Thank you. I'm going to hand back to Sam.